This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the tool to use to make a website for your brand and grow your business. More about them in just a bit. The country of Mexico has a very long and rich history associated with it, along with vibrant culture that borrows from many different sources that blend together into something unique. One of the places most closely associated with Mexico's history and culture is the city of Guadalajara, traditionally known as Mexico's second city. It has survived disaster and war to become one of the country's economic and cultural hubs. Despite this, it gets far less attention paid to it by the international community than other cities like Juarez, Tijuana, and Monterrey, meaning most people outside of Mexico probably don't know much about Guadalajara. Well, luckily for you, we're here to fill in the gaps. Guadalajara's history dates back to the early 1530s. This was the period when Spanish conquistador Nuño de Guzman was cutting a bloody swath through what is today western Mexico, killing and enslaving thousands of natives while trying to gain power and influence for himself in the royal court back in Madrid. Guzman was so violent and so oppressive that he was eventually denounced by the other conquistadors and shipped back to Spain in disgrace. When you consider how awful the average conquistador was, the fact that they all decided Guzman was too extreme was definitely saying something. Anyway, Nuño de Guzman is only tangentially related to this particular story. In 1531, one of Guzman's captains, Cristobal de Onate, founded a town in an uninhabited section of the Atamayac Valley to serve as a defensive bulwark for Spanish settlers against the surrounding tribes of understandably hostile natives. Onate named it Guadalajara after his boss's hometown in Spain, yet another example of New World city names coming from their founders' attempts to suck up to their superiors. The Spanish Guadalajara, in case you were interested, is derived from the original Arabic name for the place, Wadi al-Haraya, which means either Valley of the Stone or Fortress Valley, depending on the translation. Guadalajara was moved around the valley 3 times before settling in its current location in 1542, about 575 kilometers from Mexico City to the east. It became the capital of the Spanish province of Nueva Galicia in 1560 and continued to be so for the remainder of Spanish rule. Many of Guadalajara's most historic buildings date from the Spanish period, including the cathedral, which was completed in 1618 and has survived numerous earthquakes over the following 4 centuries. The University of Guadalajara dates from 1792 and is the second oldest institution of higher learning in Mexico. Guadalajara found itself at the center of the Mexican independence movement briefly in 1810, when the first leader of the insurgency against Spanish rule, the Catholic priest Miguel Hidalgo, marched into the city with his rebel forces. While in Guadalajara, Hidalgo attempted to form an independent government with himself at its head. The Royalist army attacked the rebels in January 1811, decisively defeating them at the Battle of Calderon Bridge, compelling Hidalgo to abandon Guadalajara. A few months later, Hidalgo was captured and he was executed. The war would continue until 1821, culminating in Mexico's emergence as an independent nation. In 1823, Nueva Galicia became the state of Jalisco, with Guadalajara remaining as the regional capital. The city saw heavy fighting during the Civil War, known as the Reform War, lasting from 1858 until 1860, changing hands 4 times as both liberal and conservative factions fought over what they saw as a key strategic location. During this time, over a third of Guadalajara was destroyed. 4 years later, soldiers again marched into Guadalajara, this time flying French colors. The forces of French Emperor Napoleon III invaded Mexico in an attempt to install a regime more friendly to European interests, occupying Guadalajara and much of Mexico in 1864. They installed an Austrian Archduke, Maximilian, as Emperor of Mexico. Republican forces fought back, and after the United States threatened to intervene on their behalf, the French withdrew in 1866. The Empire of Maximilian collapsed, and the would-be Mexican monarch was shot in June 1867. Violence again visited the city in the 1910s as the entire country collapsed into the Mexican Revolution. In December 1914, Guadalajara was briefly occupied by the rebel leader Pancho Villa before being chased out again in January by forces loyal to Venustiano Carranza, his chief rival for control of Mexico. By the end of the fighting in 1920, 2.7 million Mexicans had died, and the economy of the country had been shredded. In 1926, Mexico was once again on the verge of civil strife, this time centered on religion. Plutarco Calles, an ardent atheist, was the president, and he passed laws designed to crack down on organized practice of religion within the country. The mainly Roman Catholic peasantry, spurred on by the clergy, pushed back, and it was in Guadalajara that things finally tipped over into violence. On the 3rd of August 1926, a force of 400 armed Catholics barricaded barricaded themselves inside the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe and exchanged fire with federal troops. 18 were killed and 40 wounded before the rebels surrendered after running out of ammunition. These were the first deaths in what became known as the Cristero War, a violent rebellion by largely rural, deeply devoted Catholics who fought against government attempts to suppress their religion. The Cristeros, as they were called, were most heavily concentrated in Jalisco, in the hill country to the northeast of Guadalajara. The city itself remained in government hands throughout the conflict, withstanding a rebel assault on it in 1929, but many city residents made up the ranks of the Cristeros. The war would claim another 250,000 lives, and as much as 5% of the country's population emigrated to the United States, especially the growing city of Los Angeles. Despite the frequent outbursts of violence, Guadalajara continued to grow in both size and importance. By the time of the start of the Mexican Revolution, it was already the second most populous city in the country. After the Cristero War ended in 1929, peace returned to the region, but economic growth was stymied again, this time by the onset of the Great Depression, which impacted all of Mexico throughout the 1930s. The city recovered at the end of the decade and soon embarked on one of the most impressive urban growth spurts in Mexican history. Every decade, from the 1940s to the 1980s, Guadalajara's population doubled. In 1964, it topped 1 million residents. Today, the metropolitan area has more than 4 million. For over a century, it was the second largest city in Mexico until the 2020 census, when it was passed by Monterrey and dropped to third on the list. This growth was fueled by out-of-work farmers moving to the city to get jobs in the manufacturing sector, particularly the textile and shoe industries, which made goods for sale in both Mexico and for export, mainly to the United States. To go along with this drastic population increase came an increase in the size of the city, expanding beyond the colonial-era city center, or Centro District, to include 4 more much larger districts. To the west, Guadalajara's wealthier residents settled into Hidalgo in the north and Juarez in the south. To the east, the working-class poorer neighborhoods, Libertad in the north and Reforma in the south. This distinction has blurred somewhat in recent years as the wealthy leave the city altogether for suburban bedroom communities like Zapopan, and lower-income families take their place in Guadalajara. Starting in the 1980s, Guadalajara's economy modernized, transitioning into technology, particularly the manufacture of electronics, leading the city to become known as Mexico's Silicon Valley. Major international corporations such as IBM and Hewlett-Packard set up shop in the city, and foreign investment flooded in. At the start of the 1990s, the future seemed bright, and then out of nowhere, one of the strangest disasters ever to befall a modern city made the streets of Guadalajara literally explode. Now, just before we continue with today's video, I gotta tell you about a service that you've honestly probably never heard of before. Squarespace. Just kidding, everybody has heard of Squarespace, and that's because they are the absolute best place to build a website in 2022, and also because there's lots of ads out there like this one telling you to do that. But seriously, if you need a website, there's no point considering anyone else. If you have the thought enter your mind, I need a website for my business or blog, the only thing that should enter your mind is, I must go to squarespace.com and build my beautiful website. And why? Because websites are just ridiculously easy to make and feature-rich with Squarespace. Imagine this situation. You know nothing about websites. You've seen them online, you think they look nice, and you're like, I need one of those for my business. Or maybe I just want to share my annoying political opinions with everyone else in a blog, you know? You do you. And also, Squarespace can help you run a business. Look, they just don't do blogs, which they do beautifully, by the way. You can also sell things through Squarespace, which, you know, is good if you have a business. It's what businesses do. Or maybe you just want to sell memberships or something to your online cat yoga class. It's all possible. It's not all sensible, but it is all possible with Squarespace. Plus email campaigns, analytics, social integrations, all of that good stuff that you would expect. Plus, it's super easy for a beginner to put together. Perfect. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. April the 22nd, 1992. It's market day in Guadalajara, and the streets are packed with people on their way to do their weekly shopping. Bad smells are not uncommon in a big city like this, but the smell settling over the area of Gante Street in the Reforma district of the city for the last 3 days has been particularly noxious. It's causing lightheadedness. Some people have fainted. Mysterious fumes are puffing suddenly out of manhole covers, and residents are beginning to report that their tap water has been contaminated. It tastes like gasoline. Something clearly going wrong under the streets of Guadalajara. But at 9:30 that morning, the city fire chief gave an interview on the radio informing affected residents that they weren't in danger and there was no need to evacuate. Less than half an hour after the fire chief went off the air, an explosion tore through the streets without warning. The pavement was blown upwards, sending cars and buses flying through the air and crashing into buildings, which were also blown to pieces, collapsing as their foundations crumbled. The entire street collapsed, sending cars, houses, and people tumbling into a trench 5 meters or more deep. This would have been bad enough, but a few minutes later, further down the road, it happened again. And then again. Over the course of 4 hours, at least 10 different explosions blew the Reforma district apart, leaving behind a wave of destruction that stretched 8 kilometers. The toll of the disaster was staggering. 15,000 people were left homeless. 1,000 injuries were reported. Officially, 206 people were reported killed. However, other estimates place the death toll as high as 1,000. Hundreds of businesses were either destroyed or damaged. Lloyd's of London placed the economic cost of the disaster at between $300 million and $1 billion. Everyone was asking what the hell had happened in Guadalajara. Aerial photographs of the disaster zone showed that the explosions had occurred in a line coinciding with the sewer main that ran through Reforma. That had been the origin point. But what had caused it? Initial suspicion fell on a cooking oil company that used a chemical called hexane in their manufacturing process. Had they dumped dangerous quantities of their waste into the sewers? It had happened before. In 1981, more than 13 miles of sewers and the streets above them were destroyed in a gas explosion in Louisville, Kentucky, after a Purina factory illegally dumped thousands of gallons of hexane into the city's sewer lines. However, the cooking oil company in Guadalajara insisted that they were blameless. They only worked with small quantities of hexane, and their entire stockpile was less than the amount needed to cause the level of destruction seen in these explosions. The other main suspect was PEMEX, Mexico's state-owned oil company, which had a gasoline storage depot in Guadalajara. To get gasoline to the depot from their refinery in Salamanca, the company had built a 30-centimeter wide underground pipeline that most people didn't even realize ran right under the streets of the city. An inspection of this highly pressurized pipeline revealed a hole, and gasoline had been squirting out of the pipe and into the ground for at least a week prior to the disaster. A water pipe was touching the gas pipe here, installed 5 years before, bent around the pipeline to make it fit. This poor design caused a reaction known as metal-to-metal corrosion, when iron, coated in zinc, and steel touch each other in damp conditions. This causes a chemical reaction to take place that gradually destroys both of them. Once the gas was flooding the soil, it surrounded the nearby sewer line, seeping into the pipe through joints and cracks in it. It also made its way into water pipes, contaminating the fresh water supply. The design of the sewer itself also contributed to the disaster. Since the days of the Roman Empire, sewers had traditionally been built on an incline, allowing waste to flow away via the force of gravity. But in Guadalajara, the sewer line had been modified to make way for the installation of a subway line, bending it into a U-shape around the train tracks. The new design allowed liquid waste to escape, but trapped the deadly gasoline fumes upstream of the blockage, causing a dangerous build-up as the sewer was inundated with it. And all it would take from there was a single spark. In the aftermath of the disaster, 9 people were arrested, including the city's mayor. However, no one was ever held criminally or civilly responsible for the disaster or for the municipal government's failure to evacuate the area, despite knowing of the danger that the sewer contamination posed. Because of this, victims of the tragedy and their families have had to wait years to receive any compensation for their losses, if they ever got any at all. This led to lasting bitterness on the part of city residents, and is probably the major reason why the ruling PRI party lost power in the municipal elections of 1995 to their rivals PAN. It took years for the city to recover from the gas explosions of 1992, especially once the economic crisis resulting from the devaluation of the peso occurred in 1994. Driving through the Reforma district today, it's easy to trace which streets were affected by the disaster because of the modern architecture of the rebuilt buildings. Now you must be thinking, well, surely there's more to Guadalajara than a history of repeatedly getting blown up or attacked, right? And well, you would be right. In fact, Guadalajara and the surrounding area is home to so many staples of Mexican culture that it's sometimes known as the most authentically Mexican city in Mexico. First, let's set the scene with some music. The style of music most closely associated with Mexico is mariachi. It's appeared in the soundtrack of so many Western movies, among other places, that it's almost impossible for you to not have heard a mariachi song at least once. The style of music, today consisting of multiple violins, a couple of trumpets and a guitar, along with vocals, has its origins in the folk music played during the colonial period in rural Jalisco. In the 19th century, as farm workers dried up and people started migrating to the city of Guadalajara, the rural sounds mixed with the urban music played at the time to form something unique. Mariachi performances caught on in Mexico City and elsewhere in Mexico at the end of the 19th century, and after the Mexican Revolution ended, the government promoted the music style as an international cultural symbol of the nation, exporting it to the United States and Europe through records and films. Today, Guadalajara is home to the Festival of Mariachi, which attracts bands from across Mexico and around the world. The festival includes a parade with floats and is capped off with the Charreria competition, a sporting event that showcases the skills of a traditional charro or cowboy, including horsemanship, bull riding, and lasso work. When not performing at the festival, you'll be able to catch a mariachi performance at the aptly named Plaza de la Mariachis, a popular tourist spot that also features restaurants and other stores. The region is also well known for another staple of Mexican exports, tequila. Distilled from the blue agave plant, this strong liquor has been produced in one form or another since colonial times. The drink takes its name from the city of Santiago de Tequila, located 65 kilometers north of Guadalajara, where the volcanic soil is perfect for growing blue agave by the truckload. Like French champagne, Mexican law restricts the production of tequila to this region, and many of the modern-day companies that produce tequila have lineages that measure in the centuries. Jose Cuervo, for instance, which sells over 20% of the world's supply of tequila, represents a third of the US market for the beverage, and they still produce it all at their Jalisco distillery, which opened all the way back in 1812. Guadalajara is also a sports town. One of the most popular and successful football teams in the country is Club Deportivo Guadalajara, better known as Chivas. Chivas is well known for its tradition of only signing native-born Mexican players, not international stars, earning it the unofficial designation Mexico's team. The city has also played host to matches during the 1970 and 1986 World Cups and is scheduled to do so again in 2026. The city has something for pretty much everything. Like movies, the Guadalajara International Film Festival is a week-long annual celebration that draws visitors from all over the Spanish-speaking world. Bibliophile, the international book fair, is the second largest in the entire world. Performance art, the Teatro Degollado, which opened in 1866, hosts operas, plays, and orchestral performances, among other things. If you like shopping, well, the city has shopping malls everywhere, but perhaps the best place to shop is the San Juan de Dios market, which is the largest indoor market in Latin America. It has almost 3,000 stalls selling pretty much anything imaginable, and haggling with the merchants is not only permitted, it's almost expected. The future for Guadalajara looks bright. While the population of the city itself has plateaued somewhat, the population of the suburbs and the metropolitan area as a whole continues to grow. People come to the city for a variety of reasons. Students come to study at one of the prestigious universities, while businesses set up shop there because they hope to take advantage of a well-educated yet relatively cheap workforce. Tourists come to Guadalajara too, making up a major portion of the city's economy, which in turn makes up a large part of Mexico's economy. Not only do they visit the city itself for all the reasons mentioned before, but the city's relative closeness to nearby beach destinations, especially Puerto Vallarta, makes it a natural starting point for international vacationers flying into Mexico. And there are problems too. Of course, like most of the rest of Mexico, Guadalajara finds itself dealing with drug cartels and the violence associated with them, particularly the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is based in and around the city and fights both other cartels and the government authorities. However, the violence, while bad, isn't considered as severe in Guadalajara as in other cities like Veracruz or Tijuana, and it is considered about as safe a place for foreign tourists to visit as any large city in the US or Europe. In fact, it would probably surprise you to learn that most everywhere in Mexico is safe for gringo tourists, as long as you don't try anything silly, like trying to buy cocaine. If you plan to visit the city, your best bet is probably Uber for transportation. Despite a lot of recent investments in public transportation, Guadalajara's bus and train lines still suffer from overcrowding and long wait times, and as for renting a car yourself, it may be difficult to find somewhere to park it. In fact, if you're a visitor from Europe, driving might be the most dangerous thing you do in Mexico. 15,000 people die a year in car crashes there, a figure that is comparable to the US but much higher than anywhere in Europe. One problem Guadalajara doesn't have is with its sewer system. After the 1992 disaster, the city built a state-of-the-art replacement that features sensors to detect any buildup of dangerous gases, and the gasoline pipeline that leaked was rerouted away from the city. The point is, Guadalajara has a rich history and a lot to offer both Mexico and the world, whether you're a resident or just visiting. Perhaps while you're there, you might be inspired to try Mexico's national dance. The point is, Guadalajara has a rich history and a lot to offer both Mexico and the world.